Socrates and Euthyphro meet by the porch of the king Archon, an official responsible for overseeing matters of religious law in Athens. Euthyphro is surprised to find Socrates there and asks what has brought him to court. Socrates explains that he is being prosecuted by a young man named Meletus, an unfamiliar figure with straight hair, a sparse beard, and a hooked nose. Meletus accuses Socrates of corrupting the youth of the city, and has taken it upon himself to bring charges against him. With characteristic irony, Socrates comments on what a promising start Meletus is making by seeking out and eliminating those who allegedly harm the city's youth. Socrates himself believes that the cultivation of virtue in the young is a matter of utmost importance. In addition to the charge of corruption, Meletus also accuses Socrates of introducing new gods and failing to acknowledge the traditional deities of Athens. Euthyphro responds by suggesting that this accusation may stem from Socrates' well-known claim to be guided by a divine sign or inner voice. He adds that he too is often met with disbelief when he speaks of the divine or makes prophetic claims. Still, he encourages Socrates to endure such skepticism, expressing confidence that he will ultimately be vindicated. Turning the conversation, Socrates asks what has brought Euthyphro to court. To Socrates' amazement, Euthyphro reveals that he is prosecuting his own father for murder, a serious religious offense in Greek society. Socrates is taken aback by the boldness of this act, suggesting that Euthyphro must be exceptionally wise in religious matters to pursue such a case. He also assumes the victim must have been a member of Euthyphro's own family to warrant such dedication. But Euthyphro clarifies that the victim was not a relative, but a hired laborer who had been working on the family estate in Naxos. In a drunken rage, this man had killed another servant by slitting his throat. Euthyphro's father, upon discovering the crime, bound the murderer and left him in a ditch while sending for the interpreter, the official responsible for handling such religiously significant cases. However, before the interpreter could arrive, the man died of exposure. Euthyphro's family is outraged at him for bringing charges against his own father over the death of a man they consider unworthy of such concern. But Euthyphro insists that divine law makes no exceptions. What is impious, regardless of personal ties. His father's action, he argues, has polluted their household with guilt, and the only way to cleanse this sin is through proper legal action. Confident in his understanding of what is holy and unholy, Euthyphro stands firm in his decision. Socrates' apparent deference to Euthyphro's expertise is, of course, deeply ironic. His exaggerated respect is not genuine, but a rhetorical device designed to expose the hollowness of Euthyphro's confidence. Rather than revealing wisdom, Euthyphro's decision to prosecute his father seems to reflect a rigid, dogmatic mindset, hardly the mark of true understanding. There's another layer of irony in Socrates' mention of Meletus, the man responsible for bringing him to trial on charges of corrupting the youth of Athens. While Meletus plays a more central role in the apology, here he is briefly sketched with cutting sarcasm. Socrates calls him a young unknown, and offers an unflattering physical description, suggesting that his motivations are far from noble. Yet Socrates mockingly praises Meletus for his efforts, remarking that anyone concerned with improving the youth must be performing a great public service. This is a classic Socratic twist. Socrates himself devoted his life to engaging with young minds, encouraging them to question assumptions and think critically. In a bitterly ironic reversal, Meletus claims to protect the youth by silencing the very man who sought to awaken their minds. The deeper irony lies in the fact that Socrates sincerely believed that true knowledge, especially moral knowledge, was the greatest good. His method of questioning was not meant to humiliate, but to educate. In pointing out others' ignorance, he hoped to instill humility and intellectual honesty, traits he believed essential for genuine learning. Thus, his claim that Meletus is performing a noble service by prosecuting him is heavy with irony. If Meletus were truly working for the youth's benefit, he would be supporting Socrates, not seeking his death. This context also explains why Meletus is portrayed in such a negative light. Euthyphro was likely written not long after Socrates' execution, and Plato, his devoted student, had every reason to present Meletus as both petty and foolish. The bitterness is clear in Plato's dismissive tone and the caricatured physical description of Meletus, and it is amplified by Euthyphro's own prediction that everything will turn out well for Socrates in his trial, a tragically ironic statement given what we know is coming. Euthyphro, who claims prophetic insight and divine knowledge, utterly fails to foresee Socrates' fate, further undercutting his credibility. Also mentioned in the dialogue is the divine sign, a recurring motif in Socratic literature. Socrates describes it more fully in the Apology, as a kind of inner voice or spiritual warning. It never tells him what to do, only what not to do, usually preventing him from making choices that could lead to danger. It's for this reason, he says, that he avoided political life, having been warned by the sign that it would bring him trouble. This small divine voice stands in stark contrast to the grand claims of prophetic knowledge made by figures like Euthyphro. While they claim certainty, Socrates remains modest, guided not by dogma but by a quiet, intuitive check on his actions. That alone speaks volumes about the difference between true wisdom and the pretense of it. Socrates, astonished by Euthyphro's bold decision to prosecute his own father on what seems to be a questionable charge, remarks that such an action must be backed by a precise and thorough understanding of religious matters. Euthyphro, without hesitation, claims exactly that. He sees himself as an expert in all things divine, superior in knowledge to the average person. Seizing upon this bold claim, Socrates slyly proposes that perhaps Euthyphro could instruct him in religious affairs. That way, should Meletus pursue his prosecution against Socrates, Socrates could explain that he is now a student of Euthyphro, an unquestioned authority in such matters. If Meletus persisted, Socrates could even suggest that the blame lay with Euthyphro as his teacher. Euthyphro agrees enthusiastically, confident that with his expertise, Socrates would easily overcome Meletus' accusations in court. Socrates then presses Euthyphro to begin his instruction, asking him to define what is holy and what is unholy. They both agree that there must be a single characteristic or standard that makes all holy actions holy, and by contrast, all unholy actions unholy. Socrates asks Euthyphro to identify this defining feature. Euthyphro responds by saying that prosecuting those who commit injustices is holy, while failing to do so is unholy. To support this, he references Greek mythology, citing how Zeus punished his own father, Cronos, who in turn had acted violently against his own father, Uranus. Since Zeus, the most just and powerful of the gods, acted rightly in this, Euthyphro believes he is justified in prosecuting his own father as well. Socrates is intrigued, but also somewhat puzzled by this example. He asks Euthyphro if he truly believes all the myths about the gods, that they fight, quarrel, and engage in violent acts as described by Homer and Hesiod and depicted in art. Euthyphro confidently affirms that he does, and even more than what the common man knows. He claims his knowledge of divine matters is deep enough to enlighten Socrates on things he never imagined. Socrates, amused, suggests that such lessons might best be left for another day. For now, he returns to the task at hand, defining holiness. He points out that Euthyphro's earlier example, prosecuting the unjust, is merely a particular instance of a holy act, not a definition of what holiness itself is. Euthyphro concedes the point, acknowledging that many holy deeds are unrelated to prosecution. Socrates then urges him to offer a more general, universal definition that could serve as a standard by which all holy acts can be identified as holy. This insistence on a universal definition touches upon a theme that would become central in Plato's later philosophy, the theory of forms. According to this theory, every concept or quality, such as beauty, justice, or holiness, has a corresponding perfect form. These forms exist in a transcendent realm and are the true reality behind the imperfect copies we experience in the material world. While the theory of forms becomes a major focus in Plato's middle dialogues, such as Phaedo and the Republic, it is only hinted at in earlier works like Euthyphro. In this dialogue, Plato employs some of the same language and concerns, such as the search for an essential feature common to all holy things, but does not yet develop the full metaphysical theory. That said, Socrates' line of questioning in Euthyphro makes perfect sense even without invoking the technical aspects of the theory of forms. His concern is straightforward. One cannot claim to understand what holiness is merely by pointing to particular examples. A proper understanding requires identifying the essence or standard that explains why those examples are holy in the first place. After Socrates dismisses Euthyphro's initial definition of holiness as the act of prosecuting religious offenders, Euthyphro proposes a second definition. Holiness is what is agreeable to the gods. Socrates responds positively to the general form of this new definition, appreciating its attempt to provide a standard that could be applied universally. However, he immediately begins to test its validity. Socrates recalls the well-known quarrels among the gods as depicted in the mythological tales of Hesiod and Homer, stories that Euthyphro accepts literally. These divine disputes, Socrates observes, do not arise from disagreements about matters of fact, which can be resolved through calculation or observation, but from differences in values, such as what is just or unjust, good or bad. If the gods argue over these moral questions, then they must hold conflicting opinions about what is just and unjust. From this observation, Socrates draws a critical conclusion. If the gods disagree on questions of justice and goodness, then they must approve of different actions. Some gods may favor a particular deed, while others may disapprove of it. By Euthyphro's own definition, this would imply that the same action could be both holy and unholy, approved by some gods and disapproved by others. Socrates uses the example of a morally ambiguous act, such as prosecuting one's own father, to illustrate the point. One god might approve of it, while another might not. Thus, Euthyphro's second definition collapses into contradiction. In response, Euthyphro refines his claim, arguing that all the gods would surely agree that someone who kills unjustly should be punished. But Socrates identifies a crucial flaw. The disagreement isn't about whether an unjust killer should be punished. That much is assumed. The real issue is whether a particular act, such as the one Euthyphro is prosecuting, qualifies as unjust. Therefore, to defend his position, Euthyphro must demonstrate that all the gods agree not just on the general principle, but on the specific case, that his father's actions were indeed unjust. Socrates presses the point. It is not enough to say that all the gods would approve of punishing a wrongdoer. Euthyphro must show that his father is undeniably guilty of wrongdoing in this case. After all, the man his father allowed to die had himself committed a murder in a drunken rage. Whether or not the father's actions were unjust, and thus deserving of divine disapproval, remains a matter of dispute. Before Socrates begins to dismantle the argument, he ensures that Euthyphro's claims are clearly stated. Clarity is essential for scrutiny. Once the claim is properly articulated, Socrates begins applying his method of elenchus, or cross-examination, to explore the consequences of Euthyphro's assertion. This method is central not only to the Euthyphro dialogue, but to Plato's philosophical approach as a whole. According to Plato, especially in his middle period works like the Meno and the Republic, true knowledge requires more than just holding a correct belief. It must be grounded in understanding and reasoned justification. For example, merely being told the Pythagorean theorem does not amount to knowing it. To know it, one must grasp the reasoning and be able to work through the proof independently. In a similar fashion, Socrates aims not simply to refute Euthyphro's arguments, but to lead Euthyphro to realize the flaws in them himself. Rather than outright rejecting Euthyphro's claim, Socrates encourages him to examine the implications of what he has said. For instance, Euthyphro holds that holiness is what is agreeable to the gods, but he also admits that the gods often disagree about what is just and unjust. Socrates pushes Euthyphro to reconcile these two claims without providing the answer himself, hoping that Euthyphro will come to see the contradiction on his own. Socrates now shifts the course of the discussion with a profound and enduring question, one that would later be known as the Euthyphro dilemma. He asks Euthyphro whether holy acts are loved by the gods because they are holy, or whether they are holy because they are loved by the gods. In other words, is holiness an independent quality that the gods recognize, or is it a quality something has only because the gods choose to approve it? To clarify the issue, Socrates introduces a key philosophical distinction, the difference between a thing being in a state and it getting into that state through an external action. For example, something is being carried because it gets carried. It doesn't get carried because it is already being carried. The object is in the state of being carried as a result of someone choosing to carry it. Similarly, a thing is changed because something changes it. It is not the case that it is changed by something because it is already in a changed state. Socrates then applies this logic to the question of divine approval. A thing is being approved because it gets approved, that is, because someone decides to approve of it. It is not the case that it gets approved because it is already in the state of being approved. Transferring this to the notion of holiness, Socrates shows that if something is holy because it gets approved by the gods, then holiness depends entirely on divine approval. But if, as Euthyphro originally claimed, the gods approve of things because they are holy, then holiness must exist independently of the gods' approval. From this reasoning, a crucial distinction emerges. What is holy is not the same as what is approved by the gods. If holiness is the reason the gods approve of something, then holiness cannot be defined simply as what is approved by the gods. Otherwise, we end up in a circular argument, where the gods approve something because it is holy, and it is holy because the gods approve it. Alternatively, if we insist that holiness is caused by divine approval, that something becomes holy because the gods approve it, then we are forced to abandon the idea that the gods approve something because it is already holy. One cannot have it both ways. Thus, Socrates exposes a deep philosophical problem in Euthyphro's definition. Either holiness is independent of the gods, in which case the gods merely recognize it, or holiness is entirely dependent on the gods' preferences, in which case it becomes arbitrary. Euthyphro's attempt to define holiness has, once again, fallen into contradiction. Although Socrates' argument may initially seem complex and difficult to express clearly, it is, at its core, relatively straightforward. The discussion revolves around three ways we might describe a particular action, as well as three key claims to which Euthyphro is committed. The three descriptions of a deed are: it is holy, it gets approved by the gods, it is divinely approved. The subtle but important distinction here lies between 2 and 3. Statement 2 refers to the gods actively approving the deed. It highlights the action of divine approval. Statement 3, by contrast, describes the state of the deed as one that is already approved by the gods. In other words, 2 is about the process, 3 is about the outcome. Socrates earlier argued that something enters a certain state because it undergoes a process, not the other way around. For instance, a thing is in the state of being approved because it gets approved. It makes no sense to say it gets approved because it is already in that state. Applied to this context, the act of divine approval, 2, must come before and explain the condition of being divinely approved, 3. Euthyphro's position commits him to the following three claims. A. Something gets approved by the gods because it is holy. B. Something is in the state of being divinely approved because it gets approved by the gods. C. What is holy is what is divinely approved by the gods. In symbolic terms, A says, if 1, then 2. B says, if 2, then 3. C says, 1 is equal to 3. But here's the problem. If 1 leads to 2, and 2 leads to 3, then 1 leads to 3. That's a chain of causation, not an identity. You cannot claim that 1 and 3 are identical if one causes the other through an intermediate step. Therefore, Euthyphro's claim that holiness is the same as being divinely approved, 1 is equal to 3, contradicts his own logic. To be fair, it is entirely possible that the things which are holy and the things that are divinely approved happen to be the same in terms of content. Every holy deed might be divinely approved, and vice versa. But this does not mean the concepts of holiness and being approved by the gods are the same. An analogy helps. Every creature with a heart also has a kidney, but creature with a heart does not mean the same thing as creature with a kidney. The reference might overlap, but the meaning does not. In the same way, Socrates, and Plato through him, argues that even if what is holy and what is divinely approved always align, they are not conceptually identical. Thus, Euthyphro cannot claim that holiness is simply being approved by the gods. Socrates, still unsatisfied with Euthyphro's earlier claim that holiness is simply what is approved of by the gods, asks him once again to offer a clearer definition. Euthyphro, growing frustrated, accuses Socrates of constantly making arguments go in circles so that no firm conclusion can ever be reached. But Socrates gently corrects him. It is not he who is spinning in circles, but rather Euthyphro's own answers that are looping back on themselves. Socrates then encourages Euthyphro to keep searching for the truth and offers a suggestion to help him refine his view. Perhaps everything that is holy is also just. He then probes further. Does that mean everything just is holy, or only some just acts are holy? To clarify the kind of distinction he is trying to make, Socrates quotes a line of poetry, "Where there is fear, there is also shame." He disagrees with the quote, noting that people often fear things like disease or poverty without feeling ashamed. However, wherever shame exists, there is always some kind of fear, specifically, the fear of losing one's reputation. This comparison sets up Socrates' next point. Maybe holiness stands in the same relation to justice as shame does to fear. That is, all holiness involves justice, but not all justice involves holiness. Euthyphro agrees. He concedes that holiness may be only a part of justice. With this, Socrates believes they are making progress. If holiness is a subset of justice, then the next step is to identify which part. What kind of justice does holiness represent? Euthyphro offers an answer. Holiness is that part of justice that concerns looking after the gods, while the other parts of justice deal with how we treat other people. Socrates finds this promising, but wants to clarify what Euthyphro means by looking after. For example, when someone looks after horses, like a groom, they improve the horse's condition. A cattle farmer benefits the cattle, and a kennel master benefits the dogs. So, Socrates asks, is holiness a kind of care that improves the gods? Does performing holy acts somehow make the gods better? Euthyphro recoils at the suggestion. No, he says, he does not mean that kind of looking after. Rather, he compares our role to that of slaves serving their masters, not improving them, but obeying and attending to their needs. Socrates accepts this revised comparison, but now raises another important question. People who serve others usually do so with a specific goal in mind. For instance, someone serving a shipbuilder does so to help build a ship. A general's soldiers serve with the aim of winning a war. So what, Socrates asks, is the goal of the gods that our holy actions help them achieve? Euthyphro struggles to answer directly, vaguely saying that the gods use us for many things. But Socrates presses the issue. Even if a general uses his army for many purposes, the main goal is still clear: victory. So, he insists, there must be some principal goal that defines our service to the gods. What is it? Once again, Euthyphro is unable to give a satisfactory answer. Socrates does not assert. He only asks. By doing so, he places the burden of the argument entirely on Euthyphro, compelling him to take full responsibility for the direction and content of their discussion. This, in fact, ties back to Socrates' ironic posture at the start of the dialogue, where he claims to be the student and Euthyphro the teacher. If Euthyphro is the one teaching about holiness, then he is also accountable for defining and defending the knowledge he claims to possess. The conception of holiness as a kind of service to the gods reflects a common view in ancient Greek religion, one that Plato subtly critiques through Socrates' probing. The idea implies some form of dependence on the part of the gods, which undermines their supposed self-sufficiency and divine power. When Socrates first explores this notion, he compares the relationship to that of a groom caring for a horse. In this scenario, the caretaker improves the being cared for. If holy acts serve to improve the gods, then it follows that the gods are somehow incomplete or lacking without us, a view at odds with traditional notions of divine omnipotence. Even when Euthyphro reframes the relationship as one of servants to masters, the problem remains. Service, in this case, implies that the gods require human action to accomplish their aims. Socrates' persistent question, "What is the one goal our service helps the gods achieve?" mirrors his initial demand for a single definition of holiness itself. Behind this lies a deeper philosophical impulse, the search for an essential feature that unites all instances of a concept. While it may be premature to claim that the theory of forms is fully present here, we can nonetheless detect its earliest seeds. Socrates seems to assume that holiness is not a vague collection of examples, but something that must have a unifying principle. If holiness is indeed a form of service to the gods, then that service must have one defining purpose, one unifying aim, that gives all holy acts their sacred character. At this stage in the dialogue, Euthyphro becomes increasingly frustrated with Socrates, expressing that it is difficult to gain an accurate understanding of holiness. In an attempt to clarify, Euthyphro explains that holiness consists of actions that gratify the gods through prayer and sacrifice, and that such practices lead to salvation and happiness for those who perform them. Socrates, however, suggests that if Euthyphro's definition is so simple, he could have summarized it much earlier and in fewer words. Socrates further proposes that for Euthyphro, holiness seems to be a kind of science of sacrifice and prayer, where sacrifices are offerings made to the gods, and prayers are requests from the gods. Euthyphro agrees with this view, suggesting that holiness is akin to a skill in trading. Through prayer, humans get what they want from the gods, while the gods receive what they want from us in the form of sacrifices. Socrates then raises an important question. While humans certainly receive many benefits from the gods, what do the gods gain from our sacrifices? He presses Euthyphro to explain what the gods actually get in return for our offerings. Euthyphro responds that the gods, being all-powerful, cannot truly benefit from our sacrifices. They do not need our help. Instead, he suggests that sacrifices are meant to honor and gratify the gods. Socrates, however, points out that if the sacrifices gratify the gods, then it must be true that what is holy is simply what is approved of by the gods. This brings the conversation full circle, as it returns to the original definition Euthyphro had given, that holiness is what the gods approve of. Socrates notes that either the argument against this earlier was incorrect, or the current position is flawed. Frustrated and eager to leave, Euthyphro declares that he has a pressing appointment and excuses himself. Socrates, calling after him, expresses his disappointment, lamenting that this conversation has not advanced his understanding, and fears he will be no better off in his trial against Miletus. This conclusion is laced with irony, creating a humorous tone. It becomes increasingly clear that Socrates is not impressed by Euthyphro's supposed expertise, but is more interested in exposing his ignorance. Euthyphro's sudden departure and his increasingly flustered tone suggest that he is beginning to realize Socrates' true method. By the end of the dialogue, we are no closer to a proper definition of holiness than we were at the start. This raises the question of what we have actually learned. If anything, we have learned alongside Euthyphro that holiness is a difficult concept to define, and that our own ignorance may be more profound than we initially believed. The fact that Euthyphro's final definition turns out to be just another version of his earlier, failed argument suggests that he has run out of ideas. When we think we have found a possible definition of holiness, we might just be repeating the same mistakes. Perhaps a proper definition would have to wait for the development of the theory of forms, as hinted in earlier sections. Alternatively, we can interpret the dialogue from a more modern perspective, following Wittgenstein's ideas from the 20th century. Wittgenstein argued that many concepts cannot be defined by a single feature that all instances share, such as the concept of games, which has no one defining characteristic. This interpretation suggests that Plato, through this dialogue, might be implying that there is no single feature that all holy deeds have in common. The one thing that Euthyphro seems to recognize by the end of the dialogue is the irony behind Socrates' approach. In the end, Euthyphro leaves in frustration, realizing that Socrates has effectively made a fool of him. Perhaps in the future, Euthyphro will be more cautious in claiming certain knowledge. He might come to value careful thought and investigation, making more humble and accurate claims to knowledge. More than any specific doctrine, this lesson in humility and the importance of questioning is what Socrates has truly taught Euthyphro.